15 miles. That's all that separated victory from disaster. August 13th, 1944. General George Patton stood over a map, his tanks positioned perfectly to trap over 100,000 German soldiers with no escape route. One phone call, one push forward, and the war in Europe could have ended months earlier. Then the phone rang. "Stop where you are," General Omar Bradley ordered. "Do not advance beyond Ardennes." Patton couldn't believe what he was hearing. Bradley was ordering him to halt, with the German 7th Army broken and retreating in chaos right in front of him. "Let me go to Falaise and we'll drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk," Patton fired back. He wasn't joking. He was furious. But the order stood. 15 miles. That gap would remain open for 8 more days, and 4 months later, thousands of American soldiers would die in the Battle of the Bulge, fighting the same German veterans who escaped through that gap. This isn't just about a tactical decision. This is about how one phone call, one moment of hesitation, extended World War II and cost thousands of American lives in battles that should never have been fought. The Falaise Gap is one of the most controversial decisions of World War II, and if you're into the untold stories and critical moments that changed history, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Hit that subscribe button because we're diving deep into the decision that haunted Allied commanders for the rest of their lives. August 1944. Northern France. The situation was almost too good to be true. After 6 brutal weeks grinding through the Normandy hedgerows, the Allied breakout had finally come. Operation Cobra smashed through German lines at St. Lo on July 25th. General Lightning Joe Collins punched a hole in the German defenses, and Patton's Third Army poured through like water from a broken dam, racing east and south across France. Then Hitler made the worst decision possible. Instead of ordering a fighting withdrawal to the Seine River, he demanded a counterattack. On August 7th, 4 Panzer divisions attacked west toward Mortagne, trying to cut off the American breakout. It was suicide. The attack failed completely within 48 hours, and now the Germans were trapped in a salient with Allied armies closing in from 3 sides. British and Canadian forces pressed from the north toward Falaise. American forces wheeled around from the south and east. The pocket was forming. By August 12th, over 100,000 German troops from the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a shrinking area between Falaise and Ardennes. The only escape route was a narrow gap to the east toward the Seine. This was the opportunity Allied commanders had been dreaming of since D-Day. A chance to destroy the German army in France completely. Not just defeat it, not just push it back, destroy it. Annihilate it so thoroughly that organized German resistance in France would cease to exist. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in France, knew the situation was desperate. His armies needed to escape the pocket immediately or face complete destruction. But Hitler's orders were to hold positions and continue fighting. Every hour the pocket remained open. More Germans escaped. Every day of delay allowed them to regroup and establish new defensive lines. Major General Wade Hyslop's 15th Corps had taken Ardennes on August 13th with minimal resistance. His reconnaissance units reported the road to Falaise was lightly defended. The 2nd French Armored Division and the 5th Armored Division were ready to advance immediately. Patton saw the opportunity with crystal clarity. If 15th Corps pushed north from Ardennes, while Montgomery's forces pushed south from Caen, they would link up near Falaise and trap the entire German force. It was the classic encirclement maneuver that every military strategist dreamed of executing. A textbook double envelopment. Cannae, Stalingrad. The kind of victory that gets written about in military academies for centuries. The distance was negligible. Ardennes to Falaise was 15 miles of open country. Patton's armor could cover that distance in a few hours under normal conditions. Even with German resistance, it would take at most a day or two. His tanks were already moving. His commanders were eager. His soldiers could smell victory. But there was a problem. The boundary between Bradley's 12th Army Group and Montgomery's 21st Army Group ran through this exact area. Allied planners had drawn the line to prevent American and British forces from accidentally firing on each other. Different radio frequencies, different recognition signals, different command structures. Patton didn't care about boundaries drawn on maps. He cared about destroying the German army while it was vulnerable. He told his staff they had an unparalleled opportunity to win the war right here, right now, in August 1944, and they were going to let it slip through their fingers because of coordination problems. He called Bradley and requested permission to advance beyond Ardennes toward Falaise. He was willing to accept the risk of encountering Montgomery's forces if it meant closing the pocket. The request put Bradley in an impossible position. Omar Bradley faced the most consequential decision of his command: let Patton advance and risk a friendly fire disaster, or halt and wait for Montgomery to close the gap from the north. Bradley was fundamentally cautious. He had spent his career as a staff officer before taking field command in 1943. He valued careful planning and coordination over aggressive improvisation. Patton's request to violate the boundary agreement went against every instinct Bradley had. There were legitimate tactical concerns. American and British forces had different radio frequencies and recognition signals. If Patton's armor pushed north while Montgomery's forces pushed south, they might encounter each other in confusing circumstances. The risk of American tanks firing on Canadian troops or vice versa was real, but the larger concern was political. Montgomery was technically Bradley's equal in the command structure, not his subordinate. The boundary agreement had been negotiated between Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley. Changing it required Montgomery's consent. Bradley had already endured months of friction with Montgomery over command arrangements and resource allocation. Montgomery resented American dominance of the campaign. He complained constantly about Eisenhower's broad front strategy. The relationship was tense and fragile. If American forces crossed into Montgomery's sector without permission, it would be seen as a deliberate insult. Montgomery would protest to Churchill. Churchill would complain to Roosevelt. The political consequences could damage the alliance at a critical moment. Bradley made his decision. He ordered Patton to halt at Ardennes and hold position. Third Army would not advance beyond the boundary line. Montgomery's forces would be given time to close the gap from the north without interference. It was the politically safe choice. It avoided potential friendly fire incidents. It respected the command structure and boundary agreements. It kept Montgomery's pride intact. But it left the escape route open. "Stop where you are," Bradley told Patton on the phone. "Do not advance beyond Ardennes." Patton's response was immediate and furious. "Let me go to Falaise and we'll drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk." The comment was classic Patton, aggressive, tactless, and revealing his contempt for Montgomery's fighting ability. Bradley ignored the provocation and repeated the order: "Hold at Ardennes. Do not advance." Patton argued his case. 16th Corps was positioned perfectly. German resistance was minimal. The road to Falaise was open. Every hour of delay allowed more Germans to escape through the gap. The opportunity would never come again. Bradley's answer was political, not tactical. Crossing the boundary without Montgomery's permission would create problems. Better to wait and coordinate properly than rush forward and risk an incident. Patton hung up the phone knowing he had lost the argument. He called his corps commanders and issued the halt order with barely contained rage. Third Army would stop at Ardennes and wait for Montgomery to close the pocket from the north. Thousands of American tanks sat idling along the road south of Falaise. Crews shut down their engines and climbed out onto the hulls. They could hear artillery fire in the distance. They could see the smoke rising from German positions ahead. The road to Falaise was open in front of them. But they weren't moving. They sat and waited while their officers explained that coordination with Allied forces required patience. The tankers looked north toward the gap and wondered why they were stopping when the enemy was running. Patton paced his headquarters with the map in front of him. The gap between Ardennes and Falaise mocked him. 15 miles. That's all it would take. He told his staff they were about to make the most terrible mistake of the war. They were going to let the German army escape because they were afraid of upsetting Montgomery's feelings. He wrote in his diary that night, "The halt was a terrible mistake." 15th Corps could easily advance to Falaise and close the gap completely. But the order stood, and I am certain Montgomery will not close the gap from the north in time. Patton's prediction would prove accurate, but his protest had no effect on Bradley's decision. The halt order stood. While Patton's forces sat at Ardennes, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was supposed to be advancing south toward Falaise to close the pocket from the north. The advance was led by the 1st Canadian Army under Lieutenant General Henry Crerar, with British Third Corps under Lieutenant General John Crocker attached. These were experienced formations that had been fighting since D-Day. But the advance was slow. German forces defending the northern shoulder of the pocket were fighting desperately to keep the escape route open. SS Panzer divisions conducted fighting withdrawals, contesting every position before falling back. The terrain favored defense. The countryside around Falaise was bocage, similar to the hedgerows that had stalled the Allied advance in June and July. Every field was bordered by earthen banks and hedges that provided natural fortifications. German anti-tank guns covered every approach. Montgomery's characteristic caution was evident in the operational tempo. Canadian forces advanced methodically, with heavy artillery preparation before each assault. Casualties were kept as low as possible. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters per day. By August 16th, 3 days after Patton had been halted at Ardennes, Canadian forces had still not reached Falaise. The town finally fell on August 17th, but even then the pocket wasn't sealed. The gap east of Falaise toward Chambois remained open. Montgomery later claimed the deliberate pace was necessary to avoid excessive casualties and maintain proper control of the operation. He argued that trying to close the pocket too quickly would have resulted in chaos. But the slow advance gave German forces precious time to escape. Between August 13th and August 21st, the Falaise Gap remained partially open. During those 8 days, tens of thousands of German soldiers escaped the pocket. The gap itself shifted as Allied forces advanced from multiple directions. What started as a 15-mile opening between Ardennes and Falaise became a narrower corridor between Chambois and Saint-Lambert. But it never closed completely until August 21st. German forces poured through the gap in desperation. Soldiers abandoned their heavy equipment and fled on foot. Officers organized rearguard actions to hold Allied forces back while the main body escaped. Some units maintained discipline and withdrew in good order. Others dissolved into chaos. Allied air power devastated the German columns. Fighter bombers attacked anything that moved on the roads. Destroyed vehicles created massive traffic jams that stretched for miles. Dead horses rotting in the August heat. Burning equipment filling the air with black smoke. Pilots flying missions over the pocket reported they could smell the carnage from thousands of feet in the air. The stench of death mixed with burning rubber and fuel. Drivers in the columns had to steer around wreckage because the roads were completely blocked. Some ran over bodies and equipment because there was no other way forward. The carnage was so intense that German soldiers abandoned perfectly good vehicles just to escape on foot. The alternative was sitting in a stalled column, waiting for the next strafing run. Movement meant death from above. Staying still meant certain destruction. But the Germans kept coming. Field Marshal Walter Model, who replaced von Klug on August 17th, ordered every available unit to fight its way east toward the Seine. The alternative was surrender or annihilation. Most chose to run through the corridor of death rather than wait in the pocket to be captured. Polish forces fighting with the Canadians reached Chambois on August 19th. American forces from Patton's army linked up with them at Saint-Lambert on August 19th. The gap was finally closing, but it wasn't completely sealed until August 21st, when all organized German resistance in the pocket ended. By then, it was too late. A significant portion of the trapped force had escaped. The exact number of German soldiers who escaped the Falaise pocket has been debated by historians for 80 years. The fog of war makes precise counts impossible. Allied forces captured approximately 50,000 German prisoners inside the pocket. They counted roughly 10,000 German dead. Destroyed vehicles numbered in the thousands. The material losses were staggering. But German records suggest that between 20,000 and 50,000 soldiers escaped the encirclement. These weren't just random soldiers. They were experienced combat veterans from elite formations. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, got out. Survivors from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, escaped. Parts of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, made it through. These were the best-trained, most fanatical units in the German army. Regular Wehrmacht divisions also escaped in significant numbers. The 116th Panzer Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and Panzer Lehr all had survivors who reached the Seine and continued retreating east toward Germany. These weren't just survivors. They were the core of experienced soldiers who could be used to rebuild shattered divisions. Officers who knew how to train replacements. NCOs who understood combined arms tactics. Veterans who wouldn't panic under fire. Field Marshal Model used these survivors to form new defensive lines along the Siegfried Line and the German border. The soldiers who escaped Falaise became the nucleus of the divisions that would fight the Battle of the Bulge 4 months later. December 16, 1944. German forces launched their last major offensive on the Western Front through the Ardennes forest. Over 200,000 German troops hit weakly defended American positions with complete surprise. The offensive was spearheaded by SS Panzer divisions that had escaped the Falaise pocket 4 months earlier. The 1st SS Panzer Division led the advance in the northern sector. The 12th SS supported them. These divisions had been rebuilt with new tanks and fresh troops, but their core was the veterans from Normandy. American forces in the Ardennes suffered over 19,000 killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Total casualties exceeded 80,000. It was the bloodiest battle the U.S. Army fought in the European theater. Many of those Americans died fighting German veterans who should have been captured or killed at Falaise. The SS officers who planned small unit tactics in the Bulge had learned their craft fighting in Normandy. The panzer crews who destroyed American Shermans in Belgium had escaped through the gap in August. The connection was direct and undeniable. Every German soldier who escaped Falaise was potentially available to fight again. Not all of them made it to the Bulge. Some were killed in the fighting retreat to Germany. Some were assigned to other fronts. But enough survived to form effective combat units. Patton recognized this during the Bulge. His Third Army was called north from Lorraine to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. As he fought his way through German resistance, he noted in his diary that many of the units opposing him were formations that had escaped Falaise. He wrote, "I told them we should have closed that gap in August. Now we're paying for it in American blood." The 2nd SS Panzer Division, which fought at Falaise and escaped through the gap, was one of the divisions Patton's forces encountered trying to relieve Bastogne. The fighting was brutal. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Bradley later admitted the decision to halt Patton at Ardennes was probably a mistake. In his memoirs, he wrote that closing the gap earlier might have shortened the war and saved lives. But he never acknowledged how many lives. Bradley defended his halt order publicly by citing friendly fire risks, American and British forces converging on the same objective with different radio frequencies could shoot each other by mistake. The explanation sounded reasonable. But the friendly fire excuse didn't hold up under scrutiny. Soviet forces on the Eastern Front regularly closed encirclements from multiple directions without excessive friendly fire incidents. Proper coordination and radio discipline could manage the risk. August 19th proved the point. When American and Polish forces finally linked up at Chambois, there were no friendly fire disasters. Units from different armies coordinated successfully despite the confusion of combat. Bradley knew the friendly fire excuse was thin. In his 1951 memoir, A Soldier's Story, he acknowledged the halt order was probably wrong. He admitted the gap should have been closed sooner. He stopped short of saying how many American lives the delay cost. What Bradley never admitted in print was that the decision was fundamentally about command relationships, not tactical risks. He had chosen to avoid a confrontation with Montgomery over boundary violations. He had prioritized alliance harmony over the opportunity to destroy the German army in France. Patton understood this immediately. His supporters understood it. Military historians would debate it for decades, but the soldiers who died at the Bulge never got to weigh in on whether protecting Montgomery's pride was worth their lives. The German forces that escaped Falaise retreated to the Seine River, then back to the Siegfried Line along the German border. They formed the core of the German defense that held Allied forces through the fall and winter of 1944. The fighting in September and October 1944 was some of the bloodiest of the war. American forces attacked the Siegfried Line at Ardennes and in the Hürtgen Forest. Casualties were staggering for minimal gains. The German defenders fought with skill and determination. Many of those defenders were veterans of Normandy who had escaped through the Falaise Gap. They knew Allied tactics. They had been fighting British and American forces since June. They were experienced, battle-hardened soldiers who wouldn't break easily. If the Falaise pocket had been closed completely in mid-August, those veterans would have been removed from the German order of battle. The Siegfried Line would have been defended by hastily organized replacement units without combat experience. The Allied advance might have reached the Rhine in 1944 instead of 1945, but that's speculation. What actually happened is that Allied forces ground slowly through German defenses at enormous cost. The war in Europe continued for 9 more months. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died on both sides in battles that might have been avoided. Patton believed until his death that the Falaise Gap failure extended the war by 6 months. He argued that closing the pocket in August would have allowed Allied forces to reach Germany before German defenses could be organized. Whether he was right is unknowable. But the decision to halt at Ardennes had consequences that rippled through the fall and winter campaigns. The Germans who escaped became the soldiers who defended every river, every town, every defensive position on the way to Berlin. Historians have debated the Falaise Gap decision for 8 decades. The arguments fall into predictable patterns based on whether you prioritize military efficiency or alliance politics. Those who defend Bradley's decision emphasize the genuine risk of friendly fire between converging Allied forces. Radio communication between American and British units was problematic. Recognition signals weren't standardized. The confusion of combat in confined terrain could easily have led to tragic mistakes. They also point out that Montgomery's forces were already advancing toward Falaise from the north. Waiting a few days for proper coordination seemed reasonable at the time. The failure wasn't Bradley's halt order, but Montgomery's slow advance once the British and Canadians took responsibility for closing the gap. Those who criticize the decision argue that Patton's forces were positioned perfectly, and the opportunity was too valuable to pass up. The risk of friendly fire could have been managed with proper communication. The real issue was Bradley's unwillingness to challenge Montgomery's authority over the boundary agreement. They note that similar encirclements on the Eastern Front regularly involved Soviet forces closing pockets from multiple directions without excessive friendly fire incidents. The technical challenges were manageable if commanders prioritized effectiveness over political sensitivities. German commanders interviewed after the war were unanimous. The failure to close the Falaise Gap was the biggest tactical mistake the Allies made in the Normandy campaign. Field Marshal von Rundstedt called it inexplicable. Model said the escape saved the German army in the West from complete destruction. The debate continues because both sides have valid points. Bradley's caution was understandable. Patton's frustration was justified. The result was a compromise that satisfied neither military logic nor political necessity. December 1944. Patton stood in the snow at Bastogne, watching his soldiers fight Germans who should have been captured 4 months earlier. This was the moment he had predicted in August. The validation he didn't want. His staff officers watched him study the tactical maps showing German formations. 1st SS Panzer Division attacking from the north. 12th SS Panzer Division in support. 2nd SS Panzer Division trying to cut the road to Bastogne. All of them rebuilt around the veterans who had escaped Falaise. Patton didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. Everyone in his headquarters knew what he was thinking. The halt order at Ardennes had led directly to this moment. The decision to prioritize alliance politics over military effectiveness was being paid for in American blood in the Ardennes snow. He wrote in his diary, "I warned them we should have closed that gap in August. Now we're paying for it." But there was no satisfaction in being right. Just anger at the waste and frustration at the soldiers who had died fighting an enemy that should never have escaped. The lesson had been taught to him repeatedly throughout the war. In coalition warfare, political considerations override military logic. The best battlefield commander doesn't always get to make the decisions that matter most, and soldiers pay the price for compromises made by politicians and coalition partners. He would carry that bitterness for the rest of his life. The knowledge that he had seen the opportunity clearly, that he had made his case as forcefully as he could, that Bradley had said no, and that thousands of Americans had died because of that decision. Being right 4 months too late didn't change the fact that he had been right. One question remains. If Patton had been given permission to advance from Ardennes to Falaise on August 13th, could he have closed the gap before the Germans escaped? The tactical answer is probably yes. 15 miles of lightly defended terrain against experienced armored divisions advancing at speed. The gap could have been closed within 24 to 48 hours. Whether that would have trapped all 100,000 Germans in the pocket is less certain. Some would have escaped before the link-up. Some would have fought through the encirclement. But the vast majority, and their heavy equipment, would have been forced to surrender. The strategic consequences would have been significant. Without veteran survivors to rebuild divisions, German defenses along the Siegfried Line would have been weaker. The Battle of the Bulge might not have been possible without experienced SS Panzer divisions to spearhead it, but we'll never know. Bradley made his choice. Patton obeyed his orders. The gap stayed open. The Germans escaped, and thousands of Allied soldiers paid the price in battles that followed. 15 miles. That's all it would have taken. One day, one push, one decision to prioritize military effectiveness over political sensitivities. Instead, the gap remained open for 8 days. 50,000 German veterans escaped. 4 months later, they were killing Americans in the Ardennes. The Falaise Gap wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a strategic disaster that extended the war and cost thousands of lives in battles that should never have been fought. Bradley knew it. Patton knew it. And every soldier who died in the Bulge paid the price for a decision made in a headquarters 200 miles away, where politics mattered more than the lives of the men doing the fighting. If this story of missed opportunities and the decisions that extended World War II moved you, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. We're bringing you the untold stories and controversial moments that shaped history. The decisions commanders made, the mistakes that cost lives, and the what-ifs that historians still debate today. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Bradley made the right call? Or should Patton have been allowed to close the gap? Share this with anyone who needs to understand that sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought on the front lines. They're fought in headquarters over phones, between generals trying to balance military necessity with political reality. Thanks for watching, and remember, 15 miles can change the course of history.